So, fully automated luxury communism, like you say, provocateur, very provocative title. What does it mean? What's it responding to? I'll start at the beginning, and hopefully an area which we can generally find some agreement on, even people that may not like that C word. And that is that we live in a time of crisis. It's become a cliche, actually, to say that we live in a time of crisis, but that doesn't make it any less true. We live in a time of ecological crisis, climate systems breakdown. I'll talk about that later. We live in a moment of a declining economic model since 2008, permanently stagnating or even falling living standards, even now falling life expectancy in many places. We have a crisis of mental health. The World Health Organization says that depression will be the world's #1 burden of disease by 2030. We live in an era where we have a crisis of identity, crises of togetherness, crises of the assumptions which more or less determined human consciousness for the last couple of centuries, whether it's nation states, whether it's gender roles, whether it's social expectations about what we're going to do with our lives. So everything is kind of up in the air, this era of crisis. Now in the book I talk about 4 crises in particular, which I think are existential challenges to market capitalism. So I'm sure many of you here, and I want to ventriloquize your criticisms, but many of you here will say, oh, the guy's a Marxist, he's a historical materialist, he's an idiot utopian. We know that capitalism, yes, it has its ups and downs, but it always comes good in the end. Always creates new jobs, always creates new innovations. Even this gentleman's argument, as you'll go on to see, hinges on the fact that yes, life's got invariably much better over the last 2 centuries. We're going to agree on that. But what we're going to see over the next century, or over the rest of this century, over the next 80 years, I think really are going to challenge some of our core assumptions. So what are these crises? Let's start with the first one, the breakdown of the economic model which prevailed all the way through to 2008, financialized, increasingly globalized form of capitalism. 2008, we have Lehman collapse, we have AIG nationalized, we had Northern Rock in this country the year before. Since then, what's happened? In the UK, between 2008 and 2015, real wages, that's wages indexed against inflation, fall by about 10%. In the US, not quite as bad, but they kind of just pedal along. More concerningly, food bank rises. In this country, nobody heard of food banks until 2010. Now, millions of people are perfectly familiar with them. In the United States, the best metric of extreme poverty is food stamps, federal assistance to eat. Before 2007, 26 million Americans were using food stamps. Now, Donald Trump in 2016, for all the talk of fake news, when he said, how can Barack Obama have done so much for the US economy when 40 million people are using food stamps? That was an entirely correct number. And it's a very good response to the idea that the Democrats had run the US economy in the interests of most ordinary Americans between 2008 and 2016, because food stamps still hadn't returned to the average from before the crisis. For younger people, home ownership, particularly salient topic. In the UK, home ownership is now at its lowest level since the mid-1980s, a remarkable statistic. In the United States, home ownership is now at its lowest level since the mid-1960s. Mid-1960s, remarkable. I was talking to Vince Cable earlier, and it wasn't meant to be a moral challenge to him. I said, you can't apprehend how angry I am that I've had to live in 15 places in 15 years. Just like I can't apprehend, I can't experience, and you get knowledge from experience, apprehension, and you get knowledge from reading a book, comprehension. You can comprehend something, but to apprehend it is something entirely different. I can't apprehend what it was like to live through the Second World War. Vince Cable, or most establishment politicians, most journalists, even most people over 45 who are relatively affluent, can't apprehend the idea of living in 15 places in 15 years. What it does to your mental health, what it does to your well-being, how it destroys relationships with people. But that's one side. We don't want to get too personal just yet. So wages, flat or falling. Home ownership, flat or falling. Productivity in the UK, what's productivity? Output per person per hour worked. In the UK, productivity has gone nowhere for 10 years. Now, all of this is unprecedented. None of this has happened, generally speaking, since the invention of the light bulb. So something very strange is happening. And while on many of these measures, the UK is the most egregious example, a number of other countries have these problems too. Particularly the Baltics, particularly around Central and Eastern Europe. Some of the older people here, maybe my age and up, probably recall the talk of Japan experiencing a lost decade after the early 1990s. And then it experienced another one, and it's presently in the process of experiencing a third one. Italy, as well, has had a couple of lost decades. And what we're seeing really is a growing cluster of countries where we can say, lost decade. Britain is one of those countries. Now, I would argue, I would submit, that's the future of market capitalism in previously financialized economies, where the sources of growth were coming from insurance, real estate, services. And why did economies become like that? What happened? And why did the crisis happen? Because again, somebody like Vince Cable would say that the crisis of 2008 was because some people got greedy, like Fred Goodwin, they made bad decisions, and now we're all going to pay for it. Well, that's not the whole story. Absolutely, Fred Goodwin is a very bad person, a morally degenerate human being, as well as being a business incompetent. However, the model that we adopted until 2008 was a response to a crisis of the late 1970s, of Fordist capital, of declining profitability within industrial production, of the fact that West Germany, Japan, East Asia were increasingly competitive in terms of the manufacture of consumer durables, automobiles, etc. So we move into new areas, right? As we know all too well in this country with the City of London. And that very temporarily, and that's how you have to understand history in the long term, 30 years is temporary, very temporarily put that crisis to bed of the late 1970s of Fordist capitalism. But that re-emerged after 2008. So the idea we can go back to the pre-2008 model of corporation tax coming from the City of London like the gold of ancient Croesus, or the idea that you're going to get the kind of growth rates that we saw in Spain based on a housing boom before 2008, not going to happen. That's not going to come back. Equally, we can't return to the genius of Fordist capitalism, which preceded that for both political, economic, but also ecological reasons. So that's one crisis, an economic model which we need to resolve. Okay? I hope we can agree on some of that. Even Vince Cable and I agreed on that earlier on, it turned out. Secondly, climate change. Climate systems breakdown, because climate change isn't just one thing actually, it's a set of biological weather systems which are all deeply integrated with one another. I was interviewing a great writer on this, a guy called David Wallace Wells, about a week ago. He's written an exceptional book on this, The Uninhabitable Earth. And he put it so succinctly. He said, climate change isn't just one of the issues that we've got to address. It's not just one of the books on the shelf. It's the bookshelf. So whether you care about violence against women, whether you care about crime, whether you care about poverty in the global south, whether you care about whether young people can find opportunities in more advanced economies like Britain, climate change informs the context for all of these problems. So how bad is climate change? You know, I saw a supposedly reputable economist from the Institute of Economic Affairs, a neoliberal economist, dare I say, sitting in the sun with some cherries on Twitter. It was sunny, and he said, climate change is great. Very flippant response. Okay, well, let's look at how great climate change is. If we go beyond a world of 2 degrees warming, which is increasingly likely, it's highly plausible that we'll go to a world of 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. Not inevitable, but it's highly plausible. And what would that mean? So 3 degrees, you get the elimination of the Amazon rainforest, becomes a desert. Potentially at 4 degrees, you see methane hydrate coming out of frozen permafrost in Siberia. A bit higher, and this is where things get less certain. We have methane locked into the ocean beds, and that might also be released and discharged into the atmosphere. Science and all that, here and there. Of course, the margin of error for a planet which is 5 billion years old is always quite big. The margin of error for all of these things is thousands of years, and in terms of human politics, that's obviously a problem. Because if you're saying to somebody, the climate is changing, and then they look out the window and go, well, it's sunny outside, that's great. You know, that's not really the mental landscape we want to understand climate change within. 6 degrees warming, what would the world look like if that runaway sequence of events transpires? 6 degrees. Most of the planet would be underwater, and that which isn't underwater would be desert. Lisbon would be desert, that's how far north things would go. And the only parts of the planet actually capable of large-scale agriculture would be the north and south poles. But the biggest problem of all is that there would be so much methane in the atmosphere, anything with lungs would struggle to breathe. So we have major problems if we're moving to a world of 6 degrees. Fortunately for everybody in this room, that's not going to happen in our lifetime. Probably several thousand years away, hopefully. In the shorter term, a world of 2 degrees warming, what does that mean? And that is highly likely. That's the world that all of our children will be born into. Well, the UN, let's see what they say. They say if we have 2 degrees warming by the midpoint of this century, that would lead to 200 million climate refugees. And it's not difficult to look at the current politics of immigration to think that's a big deal. If you're worried about Aging populations, a world of low growth and hundreds of millions, maybe even a billion, climate refugees. But what do you think of the political consequences of that? I would submit Donald Trump starts to look like a liberal. Just a thought. So climate change is big. It's bigger than just more hot days. It's bigger than 25 degrees plus in February. It means...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.